Liana Torres had always believed that truth had power. Living as a trans woman in a small American city, she faced every kind of challenge life could throw at her: homelessness, rejection, and prejudice that often cut deeper than words. But through all of it, she carried herself with quiet determination. She had dreams of becoming a makeup artist, of opening a small studio where everyone could feel beautiful and accepted, no matter who they were. She worked hard, taking any job she could find, and she often used Facebook as a space to express herself. It was her diary, her stage, and her shield. Through her posts, she spoke about kindness, identity, and the struggle for respect in a world that rarely gave it freely. One cold evening, she made a post that would change everything. It wasn't meant to be dramatic, it was simply her way of standing up for herself. She wrote that a married man she had worked for had refused to pay her. She wasn't asking for pity, only fairness. Her words were honest, sharp, and brave. In her mind, she was doing what anyone would do, defending her dignity. But in a society where many refused to see her as equal, that act of honesty became dangerous. Half an hour later, Liana's name would no longer belong only to her friends. It would become a headline. That night, gunshots broke the silence of her neighborhood. By the time police arrived, it was too late. The same community that once ignored her existence now gathered outside her apartment, shocked and heartbroken. Candlelight vigils appeared where laughter used to echo. Strangers posted her photos with captions about injustice. News outlets began to share her story, first locally, then across the country. Liana's final act, her post demanding payment and respect, became more than a complaint. It became a statement about the danger of being visible as a trans woman in America. Yet, her story did not end there. Across social media, people began to rally around her memory. Activists used her name in campaigns for trans safety and awareness. Her friends started a small foundation to support trans youth, helping them with housing, healthcare, and education. In cities far from where she lived, murals appeared on walls, portraits of her smiling, surrounded by colors of pride and resilience. Her death became a spark for change, inspiring conversations in homes, schools, and churches. People began to see not just the tragedy, but the humanity. Over time, Liana became a symbol of both pain and hope. She was no longer just a victim, she was a reminder that even in a moment of fear, courage matters. Her story proved that words can outlive bullets, and that truth, once spoken, can echo far beyond the person who said it. Today, her legacy continues in the lives she touched, in the voices she awakened, and in the movement that still carries her message, that dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. And though her life was cut short, her bravery continues to shine for every person who dares to live their truth, no matter the cost. The weeks following Liana's death felt heavy, as if time itself had slowed down in grief. Her name appeared everywhere, on signs, in news headlines, and whispered through tears at community gatherings. The city, once indifferent to her struggles, now mourned her loss in public. Yet beneath the mourning was a deeper question: how could something like this happen, and why had it taken tragedy for people to care? Across the country, activists spoke her name at rallies. Social media carried her story to thousands who had never met her, transforming her final moments into a powerful symbol of both injustice and courage. The image of her smiling face, framed by pride colors, became an emblem for those who had long felt unseen. For many trans people, Liana's story was painfully familiar, another reminder of how fragile life could be when one's existence itself was seen as a threat. But alongside that pain, something else began to grow: unity. Her friends, still grieving, refused to let her story fade away. They met in small groups, planning vigils and fundraisers, creating online pages dedicated to spreading awareness. They wanted her life to mean more than her death. Slowly, a movement took shape. People began to talk about the fear that trans women lived with every day, the fear of walking home at night, of speaking out, of simply being visible. In those conversations, Liana's name became a shield for others who were still afraid. Her post, written in honesty and frustration, became a call for justice that outlived her. News outlets started covering broader issues of violence against transgender people. Community centers hosted open discussions, inviting people to learn instead of judge. Change was slow, but it was real. Liana's mother, who had once struggled to understand her daughter's identity, found strength she didn't know she had. She began speaking publicly about acceptance, telling others that love should never depend on gender or appearance. Her words touched hearts and opened doors for reconciliation in other families. For every person who felt broken by Liana's death, there was another who found purpose through it. Artists painted murals of her in bright colors, poets wrote verses inspired by her courage. Schools began holding seminars about respect and equality, and even local lawmakers mentioned her story in discussions about protecting the LGBTQ+ community. Liana had not lived to see the world change, but she had become the reason it began to. As time passed, her story turned into a quiet revolution. Her name no longer symbolized only loss, but transformation. People who had once remained silent began speaking out, realizing that silence had never protected anyone. Her legacy encouraged countless individuals to live truthfully no matter the cost. Though the world had taken her too soon, the echoes of her bravery continued to move through others like a pulse of light. Liana's truth had not just survived, it had multiplied, reminding everyone that courage, once set free, can never be silenced. Months turned into a year, but the impact of Liana's story refused to fade. Across cities and towns, her name continued to appear in murals, articles, and speeches. What had started as grief had now evolved into action. A new generation of advocates began to rise, inspired by her courage and her unwillingness to stay silent. Organizations dedicated to trans safety grew in number, offering self-defense classes, legal support, and crisis hotlines. Donations poured in, driven by people who wanted to do something, anything, to ensure that what happened to Liana would not happen again. Her friends, who had once struggled to find purpose after her death, found themselves leading marches and speaking to the media. They often described her as a light that still guided them, even in the darkest moments. Her absence was deeply felt, but her presence had somehow become stronger than ever. In classrooms and community halls, her story was told not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in empathy. Teachers used her life to talk about courage, human rights, and the importance of standing up for what is right. Young students listened, many of them hearing for the first time what it truly meant to live authentically in a world that often punished difference. Her name became a bridge between communities that had long misunderstood each other. For some, it was the first time they truly saw the struggles that trans people faced daily, not as distant headlines, but as human experiences. Liana's courage to demand fairness, even in something as small as being paid for her work, began to be seen as an act of moral strength, not defiance. Meanwhile, art and music became tools to carry her message further. Musicians wrote songs in her memory, performing them at pride events and rallies. Each note carried her story, turning sorrow into rhythm and pain into purpose. Documentaries and short films began to appear online, each one telling her story from a new perspective, some focusing on her life, others on the movement she sparked. Through every retelling, she remained a symbol of truth. People who had once felt invisible began to believe in their own voices again. Liana's story gave them permission to exist without apology. Even as the world moved forward, her message stayed simple: visibility is strength. Those who once felt powerless began organizing online campaigns, sharing stories similar to hers, and building a network of support. What started with one Facebook post had grown into a national conversation about justice and humanity. In places where hate had once thrived, there were now voices speaking of love, respect, and understanding. Liana's name became a constant reminder that progress is born from pain, and that every act of truth, no matter how small, can create ripples far beyond its moment. She had not lived to see this change, but her spirit had become part of it, proving that some lives, though brief, burn brightly enough to light the way for countless others. As years passed, Liana's story became more than a memory. It became a movement that continued to grow quietly but powerfully across the nation. Her name was spoken not only in vigils and rallies but in classrooms, board meetings, and courtrooms. Laws began to shift, slowly but surely, reflecting the push for equal rights and protection for transgender people. What had once been whispered in fear was now being discussed openly. People who once turned away from these conversations started to listen, and some even began to lead. The transformation was not perfect, and progress often came with resistance, but it was undeniable. Every candle lit in her memory had sparked another small flame somewhere else. Together, those flames formed a light that could no longer be ignored. Communities that had once been divided by ignorance began to find common ground in empathy. Churches hosted inclusive events, schools formed student groups for LGBTQ+ youth, and cities implemented programs to support victims of discrimination. Each of these steps carried traces of Liana's legacy. She had never imagined herself as a hero, but through her courage, she had become one. The people who once knew her personally still missed her laughter, her creativity, and her kindness. To them, she wasn't just a symbol, she was a friend whose bravery had changed the course of many lives. For those who never met her, she represented the possibility of living one's truth without fear. Artists continued to honor her life through their work. Murals of her smiling face appeared in neighborhoods that once struggled with intolerance, turning walls of division into canvases of hope. In one city, a community center dedicated a wing to her memory, filled with stories of other trans individuals who had found strength in her example. Her image became a beacon, not of tragedy, but of transformation. People would stop, look at her painted eyes, and see not sadness, but defiance and grace. She had become a symbol of resilience that stretched beyond gender or identity, a symbol of the human will to be seen, heard, and respected. Even as her name traveled around the world, it continued to inspire local change. In small towns, trans women found new courage to live authentically. Parents who once struggled to accept their children found comfort in her story. Teachers included her in lessons about empathy and justice. Her story was no longer about violence, it was about the power of standing up for oneself and the ripple effect that courage can create. The world had not become perfect, but it had become more aware. And awareness, as those who carried her legacy knew, was the first step toward compassion. Liana's life proved that a single act of truth, even one born out of frustration, could shift the course of history. She had become a reminder that voices may be silenced, but their echoes never fade, they grow louder through those who choose to keep them alive. Time moved on, but Liana's presence continued to shape the world she had left behind. What had once been a single moment of injustice had grown into a story of resilience that inspired thousands. Her name appeared each year during Pride Month, written on banners and whispered during moments of silence. She had become more than a memory, she was a symbol of truth, courage, and transformation. In the years after her death, the country began to see visible change. Policies that once ignored the safety of transgender people were revised, and organizations pushed harder than ever for equality. Each victory, no matter how small, felt like a step forward in her name. People still shared her Facebook post online, not as a reminder of tragedy, but as a symbol of the courage it takes to speak out. Her words had outlived her, spreading like seeds across hearts willing to listen. For her family, life would never be the same, but they learned to turn pain into purpose. Her mother started a foundation that helped trans youth with housing, healthcare, and education, ensuring that no one else would feel as alone as Liana once had. Every time the foundation reached a new milestone, her mother felt her daughter's spirit close by, guiding her to keep going. The friends who had once mourned her now worked as mentors, using their own stories to teach others about strength and self-worth. The city where she once lived honored her with an annual march celebrating authenticity and diversity, where people carried candles and posters bearing her name. The march wasn't about sadness anymore, it was about celebration, about turning grief into growth. The younger generation, many of whom hadn't even been alive when Liana's story first broke, learned her name through documentaries, music, and murals. To them, she wasn't a victim, she was a pioneer. Her courage became part of a larger story about equality and love, inspiring people from different backgrounds to stand together. Even those who had once misunderstood her found themselves reflecting on the power of empathy. Through every retelling, her humanity shone brighter than the violence that had once defined her story. She had become a reminder that even the smallest act of standing up for oneself can leave an unshakable mark on the world. Years later, when people looked back at her life, they saw not the final moment that took her away, but the movement she had sparked. Her voice, though silenced, continued to echo through the people who carried her message forward. She had shown the world that visibility was not weakness, it was strength. Her life had proven that courage could turn pain into power and that truth, once spoken, never truly dies. Liana Torres remained a symbol of hope. A beacon for every person still fighting to be seen and respected. Her story lived on, reminding the world that while hate can take a life, it can never extinguish the light of a brave soul who dared to live honestly. This is not just Liana's story. It is a reminder that courage is contagious. When one person dares to speak up, the world begins to listen.